In this chapter, we're going to discuss biopsychology, also known as neuroscience, which is basically just concerned with the brain, the parts of the physiology of the brain and the functions of the brain. And so we'll take a look at some of those in just a sec here. So first of all, neuroscientists, tend to, when they're looking at the brain, they'll use different, like what's called brain imaging techniques, such as from left to right here, we have a PET scan. That's PET. That stands for positron emission technology. Don't have to memorize that. Don't have to worry about it, but just, give you some examples here. And then in the middle here, this is a CT scan right here. And and then on the very right, we have an fMRI, which basically just means functional magnetic resonance imaging. So those are three types of brain scans. Just want to give you some examples of how neuroscientists, how doctors will actually look at the brain. So another thing to keep in mind here, this is just kind of prefacing our discussion today. The first and foremost, just keep in mind here that both nature and nurture work together to actually interact with our environment and our genes, and those actually will basically result in the individuals that we are. So real simple concept, both nature and nurture, they're constantly working together. It's not one or the other. Okay, so now we're going to begin our discussion here a little more in depth here now of the parts of the brain. And the first thing to understand here is there are what's called neurons. Most people call that nerves, but actually that is not the definition of a nerve. That's actually a neuron. We'll talk about nerves in just a little while in this discussion, but there are three basic types of neurons. There's what's called sensory neurons, and those communicate information from the environment to the central nervous system. So I call that basically from the outside in. So whenever an individual feels something, like heat, cold, pressure, touch, that's usually the sensory neurons that are communicating that information to the nervous system. Okay? Now the second type of neuron is what's called a motor neuron, and that communicates information from the central nervous system to the muscles. So basically, when an individual wants to, do anything like write with a pencil or type on a computer, that's actually motor neurons that are doing the work. Okay? The third type of neuron that's important to know is what's called interneurons. And interneurons are important because those actually communicate information from one neuron to another neuron. So what's important is to understand that part of the word called inter, within neurons that communicates from one neuron to another. So, and all neurons, they differ in size, shape, and complexity. Okay, and they have different functions obviously. So let's move on. So here are the parts of a neuron. And this is what's important for memorization and to know this. So right here on the body of the neuron, basically, what we actually call this the cell body. Okay, and then these little things right here that look like basically trees sprouting, tree limbs sprouting, or fingers. Those are actually called dendrites. Okay, and those actually, we'll talk about what those do in just a minute. Now along here, along this whole length right here of this neuron, that is actually called an axon. That is actually the pathway that an electrical impulse travels. And so I actually, even though it's not 100% correct, but I always just say, hey, just remember the axon is kind of like, electrical wire. and the electricity travels along all the way through it. Okay, now on right here, you'll notice this word right here called myelin, and the myelin sheath. So around the axon, there are these little nodules right here. Those are called myelin sheath. And those are fatty substance. So the more electricity that shoots through these, it actually triggers the buildup of this myelin around there. So it actually makes the travel of the electricity, the neural impulse, they call that, the nerve impulse. That actually, the more myelin is around an axon, that actually results in quicker transmission, quicker communication. That's why, this is really interesting. This is how this really applies to all of us. The more we do something, the better we get at it, right? Well, the whole reason why we get better, the more repetitions we do, is because it's actually building up of this myelin right here, the myelin sheath. And so take, for instance, athletes or musicians playing an instrument, or something like that. They actually get better at their craft because they are building myelin the more they practice, and there's actually impulses that travel along these axons right here. Okay, and last but not least, these little terminal buttons right here, those actually communicate with another axon that might be located right around here. See, you can see right here that they're showing, basic dendrites that are shooting out from another axon. And so I just, another neuron actually. And I just wanted to kind of, make you aware of that. Okay, so let's move forward here. So here are, you already know down below what a myelin sheath is. Okay, so I won't stay on that, but I will talk to you about glial cells. Now, glial cells right here are very important, and you can see that actually they outnumber neurons in the human brain by 10 to 1, roughly. And those actually basically give nutrition and structural support to neurons, and they make the myelin sheath. You can see that right here. And then this one in the middle, this is really important to understand, and I think you'll find this to be quite interesting. But you can see right there, the second one says removing cell waste. Well, because we have metabolic processes that occur in our brains all the time, our brains are like engines, and they're constantly running. And as they're constantly running, they are producing cell waste materials. Well, it's the glial cells that clean that out, and that usually happens while we're sleeping at night. So that's what's important. Glial cells, they actually clean the brain, keep it healthy. And then these other things too, manufacture myelin, and they supply nutrition to the neurons. So you can see that glial cells are actually extremely important to all this. Okay, now how do neurons basically communicate with each other? Well, here is the end of an basic, let's just say neuron for now, communicating with another neuron that's right here. Okay, well, actually how they communicate is one neuron produces what's called neurotransmitters, and then that releases those, and those neurotransmitters, you can see they come down and they lock right in. You can see right in here that this is locked right in to what's called a receptor. And so that is how neurons actually communicate with each other. And that is happening constantly in our brains at all times. That is how we do things. That's how we feel things. That is how we are conscious, everything. Neurotransmitters are really important. And actually, it is if those neurotransmitters aren't like optimal. Like take for instance, say, you know, unfortunately a person is not actually building up enough of those neurons in their brain. They may experience, you know, something like depression or schizophrenia or something like that. You know, so just be aware of that. Okay. And so we're going to move on. Now, what's interesting here, you remember I mentioned before along an axon, remember I said those were kind of like an electrical wire? Well, electricity isn't shooting through there just constantly. They are actually having a big burst of electricity, and then it'll travel along through segments of the axon. You know, so that's what happens. But while the neurons are in rest, you know, in a rest type situation before they fire, that's actually called resting potential. And basically all that is, in the resting potential, the neuron is negatively charged inside the cell. So inside this cell right here, you know, they do this little cross section right here, they cut this out. But inside there, right there, and then there's an arrow right here, this shows you that sodium eventually enters inside the cell. And that sodium, it starts to build up enough to where there's enough buildup of that sodium to where actually it'll fire the electrical impulse. Now that is but until then, you know, that's, by the way, that firing, that is called a positive charge. But while it's in resting potential, it's a negative charge. And so a negative charge, you know, like inside the cell right here, that is actually full of potassium. So what happens constantly, very fast, is potassium leaves the inside, and then sodium enters, and then enough potential builds up to where it becomes a positive charge, and then it fires electricity. It triggers that. Okay, so what's important to understand here, you know, definitely pause this and look at each of these, but is this term right here, the all or nothing, all or none action potential. Excuse me, I said nothing, but it's actually none. All or none action potential. And basically all that means is for a for an axon actually to fire, it has to build up a certain amount of electricity, positive impulse. And then if it does, then it'll fire. Boom. But if it doesn't, then nothing happens. That's why they call it an all or none action potential. So moving forward. Here's an important term that you should be aware of that I'd like for you to know is called reuptake. So you remember I told you, you know, the neurons basically, you know, the axons, they communicate with each other. Remember, through neurotransmitters? Well, sometimes a neurotransmitter might come down, but it doesn't hook into the receptor like maybe some of the other ones. So what happens is it actually goes back and gets recycled, and then it tries again. And that process right there of trying again, that is actually called reuptake. So just wanted you to be aware of that. And we're going to move forward. So when one axon or neuron communicates with another, there are basic types of messages that they communicate from one to another. Okay, first is, I'm going to come down here, is what's called excitatory message. So basically all that means is one neuron is increasing the likelihood that the next neuron is going to fire or activate. Okay, but sometimes a neuron might send an inhibitory message, and that decreases the likelihood that the second neuron is going to fire or activate. And actually, certain kinds of drugs actually do this. They'll actually, like, say, a neuroscientist or a doctor might say, hey, this person is actually building way too much serotonin in their brain and they're having issues. So we're going to give them this drug that actually sends inhibitory messages. It actually causes inhibitory messages to be sent along from one neuron to the next. So that gives you some example right there of how that works. Now, the reason I put this diagram in here, this little image, is just simply this, okay? You don't have to memorize the names of these little drugs right here, these neurotransmitters, okay? But what's important to know about neurotransmitters is each one has a specific shape to it. You can see that this one right here is shaped differently than this one. Well, they actually fit into the receptor sites like a key going into a lock. So, like, take for instance, this neurotransmitter right here would not fit in this receptor right here. So they have to match like a lock and a key. And that's the only thing that you really need to know by this diagram right here. Okay, so just a couple of things to remind you, okay? You don't have to memorize anything on this, but just think about this, okay? Remember, neurotransmitters, they give us the ability to perceive, to feel, to think, to move, to act, and to react. So neurotransmitters are extremely important. That's what they basically enable our brain to send messages to the rest of the brain and to the rest of the body in order to act or not to act. So just be aware of that. Okay, now this right here, we're going to begin talking about the parts of the nervous system. So one thing that a lot of people don't understand when I say nervous system is that there are a couple different types of nervous systems. So those are shown right here, okay? So the central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord, okay? Now the peripheral nervous system is everything else, basically. That is all the nerves that come from the spine and they go into our limbs. You can see it going through the arms, the fingers, and all throughout the back, going down into the legs. That is called the peripheral nervous system. So here's another diagram too. Just want to show you, that the central nervous system is what's shown in blue right here. This is the brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system is all in yellow right here, okay? So just I put those two in there to kind of help you just sort of memorize whichever image sticks with you the most. Now, remember earlier I mentioned that neurons are not nerves really. They might be made of nerves, neurons, but nerves themselves are not neurons. So actually, this is a crosscut right here. This is an actual nerve right here. And it's a bunch of neurons bundled together. So that's the important thing to learn and to understand from this, this slide right here. Okay. So a couple things, the actual neurons, those are shown here. Those are dyed in blue. But all this yellow right here going around each specific neuron, that's actually that stuff called myelin. Remember, that's that white fatty sheath, that helps neurons actually fire quicker. So just be aware of that. Okay, so now remember I mentioned, that there's parts of the two different types of nervous systems. And then one of those is divided into parasympathetic nervous system and the other is called sympathetic nervous system. So this kind of talks about what they do. Okay, so the parasympathetic, that's usually when we are in a state of alarm, we're acting out, basically you've heard of the term, like fight or flight. Well, when that instinct is triggered, when that response is triggered, usually that's your parasympathetic nervous system that's kicking in. And, so the pupils might kind of constrict, a person might salivate, that kind of thing, stimulates, that kind of thing. Okay. So, keep in mind, I'm sorry too, the parasympathetic nervous system, that's actually, I mistook there. I got ahead of myself, but, this is actually, the parasympathetic nervous system, excuse me. My cat's crawling around here. The parasympathetic nervous system, is basically, the nervous system that kicks in mostly when we're at rest. So sorry, I was looking at this as I was speaking and I was saying this, so please bear with me. So the parasympathetic nervous system is when we're at rest, which is basically the parasympathetic nervous system is kicking in right now as you're watching this and listening to this. But the sympathetic nervous system, that's what kicks in during the fight or flight response. So the pupils become dilated, the mouth becomes dry, the heart rate starts increasing, et cetera, et cetera. So just be aware of that. And so I also put in these images right here, like take for instance, this person right here, is seeing a snake coming toward them. And so their sympathetic nervous system is starting to kick in, but once the snake leaves and the person starts to relax, the parasympathetic nervous system starts to come back and kick in and function normally. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about the human brain. Okay, so, the brain really isn't that big. It's only 2% roughly of the body's weight, but it uses 20% of the body's energy. That's what's really important there. Okay, all right. So there are some parts of the brain, and so a couple things here that I put in red right here. Now this term right here is called gyri, okay, and that means more than one gyrus is what that's called. So the gyri actually, those are the actual lumpy parts in the brain, okay? So one of these is called a gyrus, but more than one is called a gyri, okay? Now the actual little folds or creases within the brain, the little indents right in here, those are called the sulci. And one sulci is actually called a sulcus. And that's spelled S-U-L-C-U-S. Okay. So just be aware of that. Okay. And a fissure is basically a deep sulcus, like a deep folding within the brain or a deep indenture, and that's actually called a fissure. So right here, the longitudinal fissure, that's actually going all the way along here. So that's just, gives you some example of that. Okay, and some more pictures, so the brain is divided basically into two hemispheres, so here's the right hemisphere. This is looking from underneath, by the way. And then this is the left hemisphere right here. Okay. Now, what's important to understand is both of those hemispheres are connected by a little area right here. It's this is actually it. This is called the corpus callosum. And this is the little area of nerve fibers that allows the two hemispheres, you can see the two hemispheres right here, but allows them to communicate with each other and to work together. Okay? And so one can see right here that the cerebral cortex right here, cerebral cortex is basically all this outer covering right here of all the main part of the brain. Let's just keep it simple and say that. Okay. And then neuroscientists, and they actually call certain areas of the brain by different names. So this whole area of the brain, right in here, this is called the forebrain. Okay. And then they have this little area in green here, excuse me. This little area in green here, this is called the midbrain. You can see that that's located roughly right in the middle of the brain, of the whole area. And then finally, they have the hindbrain, which is all this in yellow. And you can see this is all kind of toward the back of the, roughly the brain. Okay. That's why they call it the hindbrain. Okay. But there are 4 parts of the brain that are known as lobes. They can actually see those when one is looking at a picture of an actual brain. There is what's called the frontal lobe right in here. This is actually the front of the brain, and like the nose would be roughly right in this area, right in here. But this is called the frontal lobe. And then right in the basic middle of the brain, kind of heading, toward the back of the brain roughly, this is called the parietal lobe. And then the very back is called the occipital lobe. And then right here, right there is called the temporal lobe. And so there are some ways to memorize that I can offer right here. First of all, just, frontal, I think that's easy. That just means the front part of the brain. Okay, the parietal lobe, on the other hand, that name right there, there's no easy way to just sort of memorize that. So, just memorize that in and of itself. But this occipital lobe right here, occipital means vision. And so actually, when our eyes, our eyes are located roughly right around this area. So actually, when we see something, when our eyes do something, the signal is actually transferred all the way to the back of the head into the occipital lobe. And that is where it's processed. And so, people have said, well, hey, that's actually to protect the eyes, throughout the years of evolution and everything. That's why the occipital lobe is in the back of the head. So that way, if, there's damage to the front right here, one can still, see, the eyes can still work. Okay. And last but not least, there's the temporal lobe right here. Now, temporal, you can just say, hey, these are basically located real close to one's temples. We can say, our temples are roughly right about here, so this is the temporal lobe. And that is where a lot of our sound is actually processed. So when we're hearing stuff, because the ears are located roughly right in this area, so a lot of the auditory type processing that occurs in the brain is right there in the temporal lobe. Okay, let's move forward. So this person right here, his name is Phineas Gage, and he actually used to work at a railroad construction team, and he actually had a unique accident. This is in 1848, but this iron rod that he's holding right here, there was actually an explosion when he was working, and this iron rod shot up through, right up under his cheek and straight up through his head, and it just went directly through, and continued on right directly through him. Now the thing is, he survived that, and he actually got up and he said, "Hey, I'm okay," and I'll make it, and he, was okay for a while, but then he started experiencing some different types of thinking and behavior. His personality changed because the front part of his brain was damaged. That front part of the brain, by the way, is called the prefrontal cortex. That actually is in the very front part of the brain right here. Okay. So you can see right here, his eye is closed because that part was damaged. So just be aware of that, that actual damage to the brain, it actually can change thinking and behavior. And it makes people think, well, hey, is there such thing, as, how does the personality develop? And is there such thing as a soul or a spirit? And if so, then how come, does the soul or spirit have a basic identity that can be, because if one's identity can be damaged because of damage to the brain, then how does that affect that? Now, of course, I'm not, judging either way. I'm just giving some examples of some of the talk that has been explored from scientists, okay? Okay, so here's a few parts of the brain right here, and it's mostly just the name. This is called the thalamus, and that is known as the relay center of the brain. So all that talks about is if various parts, like if auditory, if hearing type information, or if visual type information comes to the brain, it is usually processed through the thalamus and then sent to other parts of the brain. So that's why they call it the relay center of the brain. I hope that makes sense. Then there's something called the limbic system. And the limbic system right here, you can see the limbic system, we're pointing at three different parts of the brain, structures of the brain actually. And they're called the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. So I just would like for you to be aware of a couple of these really quickly, okay? First of all, the hippocampus right here, even though it's very small, but it's actually the part of the brain that is known for processing memory. So if one experiences damage to that part of the brain or something, then one may have problems developing new memories. So the hippocampus has to do with memory. The amygdala also has to do with memory, but it also has to do, but it more like fearful type memories, So when one feels threatened or remembers something that's kind of fearful or makes them angry or something, usually it's the amygdala that is at work there. So that can be, work in combination with the hippocampus, it gets very complex, and it goes beyond the scope of our discussion, but I just want to make you aware of that, okay? Okay, but this right here, the hindbrain, there's three different structures. There's what's called the pons, which is this area. There's the medulla, and then there's what's called the cerebellum, okay? So I'll give you a couple of quick examples. For one thing, the cerebellum right here in the back, this cauliflower looking thing, that is actually what's responsible for our sense of balance and coordination and things. So that's extremely important to us in our lives. And the medulla right here, that's for autonomic or automatically occurring type processes like our lungs and our heart rate and that kind of thing, making sure that they stay on. So those are just some examples, okay? Okay, there were two different parts of the brain that were explored by two different people here, and these are really important just to be aware of, okay? And these two people were named Broca and Wernicke, okay? So first of all, this person right here, Broca, he basically said, look, he found a part of the brain kind of near the frontal lobe. So that he found that persons who had damage to that part, and they actually call that the Broca's area now, but if that's damaged, then they have a hard time with speaking clearly. Okay, so Broca has to do with speech. On the other hand, Wernicke, right here, he found a part of the brain, and he said, look, he found that damage to this part of this area was basically had to do with understanding. Like listening to the spoken word or seeing written communication Well, so basically, basic communication, if one is experiencing damage to that part of the brain, one will experience problems understanding spoken or written communication. So here's the two parts, so roughly, here's the Broca's area right here. And then here's the Wernicke's area right in this area. Just wanted you to see some pictures of those, okay? And we're going to move ahead. So a couple things to understand here about the brain. Now the brain can constantly change, both in in structure and function. So if one part of the brain is damaged, then another part can take over, and it can function differently. And so that ability to change, roughly, is known as the word neuroplasticity. Okay, the ability to change function and structure. So function means basically one part, like if the brain normally has to, it functions in one way, but if another part is damaged, it can actually change functions and start, doing something differently. And the same thing with structural plasticity. Basically, that means, the brain can actually change structures or shape. So that actually can happen all throughout the lifespan of a person. And then last but not least here, I have this term here called neurogenesis. That just means when new neurons are growing, are producing. Okay, so just be aware of that. And just some examples here again of some brain scans. This is actually a CT scan. This is a normal brain right here. And then this is a brain right here, but it's got a tumor right here. So this is how doctors and neuroscientists actually find these problems if someone is unfortunately dealing with these. Another type of scan called, remember, the PET scan. And then just, real quick, this is an functional MRI scan. Okay, so just, the thing is, just kind of be aware of these. Okay. And last but not least, this is, an EEG type thing. And that can basically just registers the electrical impulses that are occurring throughout the brain. And you can see this person wearing the cap right here. And then it's actually all these wires, from different parts of the brain are actually going to the machine. So it can actually measure and keep track of what's going on electrically in this person's brain. So that is all. That concludes our discussion. I realize, this chapter right here, can be kind of intense. It has a lot of rigorous information, so definitely this is the type of information that's going to take pretty much more than one time to go through. So take your time, get your study guides, and try to answer some questions, and then also use your books, and refer to this chapter as well as the slides and this video. Okay, and good luck. We'll see you on the next chapter.